Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Celeste McAlpin-Levitt. I'm from the USC Student Interfaith Council. We want to welcome you to the concluding session of the conference. Constructive, and this session is going to be called Constructive Tensions in Sacred Spaces and Sacred Clothing. Our panelists will be Patrick Mason from Claremont Graduate University, Varen Soni from the USC Office of Religious Life, Reverend Wayne Gatiss from the Missionary Baptist Church, Adina Likovic, board member at New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, and our keynote speaker, Margaret Baker. After their presentations, John Welch from Brigham Young University, the Academy for Temple Studies, and John A. Widtsoe Foundation will moderate a 15-minute question and answer session with the audience. And now, please join me in welcoming your speakers.
Well, thank you all very much for your support and attendance and being here this afternoon. We have a wonderful panel, and I think you're going to get to know them very well, and it's a wonderful way for us to conclude what has been a terrific two-day conference on sacred spaces and sacred clothing. This will be an informal thing. We don't have any particular presentations prepared at the moment. So it will be spontaneous, it will be authentic, and it will also give you an opportunity, as you get to know them and hear them in just a few minutes, to hand in questions as we've done through all of the sessions here on our conference. So let me just say, all of these people are outstanding individuals, community leaders in their professional and religious activities. And I've asked each one of them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about how they see sacred space, sacred temples or places or synagogues or mosques or whatever it might be, how that contributes to their community and their leadership and their experience, and how they personally have been involved with sacred garments or clothing or vestments of any kind. Let's hear from them on what this topic means to them as leaders of faith communities. So let me just hand the microphone down. Arun, give us the first one.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Many thanks to the organizers. I just getting over norovirus, which we had an outbreak of on campus. I wasn't able to make it for the previous sessions. I felt so guilty, but everyone told me that better will of a community that would have said that. It feels very nice to be part of a community. In my role here as Dean of Religious Life, I oversee more than 90 different religious groups. That's more than any American university. More than 50 chaplains representing every faith tradition, including a secular humanist chaplain for our atheist and agnostic students. That's also more chaplains than any other secular American university. And we do this work right here in the heart of Los Angeles, the most religiously diverse city in the history of the world. My own background is that I'm a Hindu in this role. I'm the first Hindu in American history to hold a role like this. And for the last 9 years, I've been the only non-Christian in the United States to do this work. So the work that I do, and I think the perspective that I bring, really reflects a tremendous geo-religious diversity that we see on our campus and in our city. On our campus, we interpret secularism the way the United States interprets secularism. That means all religions are endorsed one tradition or the other. So my job as the Dean of Religious Life, the University Chaplain, is to make many students presenting many different economic perspectives have access to worship spaces on our campus that are meaningful for them. So I work very closely with our students to make sure that we have space on our campus. And there is no cut and paste version to do this. We have spatial challenges. We're a campus of 40,000 on 4 square blocks, so space is a challenge. Some groups are bigger, some groups are smaller. Of course, we have this stunning Catholic center that was built over 12 years, gorgeous sanctuary. But the Catholic community is our largest community on campus with over 10,000 Catholic students. Then we have, say, a Baha'i student group that may have 10 or 12 students. So the way we think about sacred space for different groups is different based on what those groups look like, etc. Right now we have a few dedicated worship spaces on campus. We have a dedicated Hindu space, a dedicated Muslim space, a few dedicated Christian spaces. We also have a dedicated Jewish prayer space that many of our students use right across the street at Hebrew Union College. We have over 70 houses of worship within 1 square mile of our campus. So students often can walk to different houses of worship, especially the Omar Al-Khattab Mosque, which is on the corner of Exposition and Vermont. It's one of the largest mosques in Southern California, and many of our students go there for their Friday Juma prayers, the sort of main prayers of the week. We also have washing facilities on campus near our Muslim prayer space, so students can do wudu before they pray. So I think it's kind of a piecemeal approach to thinking about space, and we often have to utilize different spaces for sacred spaces. Multi-purpose spaces become worship spaces. 1 hour they could be used as a classroom, the next hour they could be used as a worship space. So I think on a campus like ours, we have to be very versatile, and we have to make sure that students have access to meaningful space, even if those spaces look different across the traditions. In terms of sacred thread, once again, we think of secularism as all religion in the public sphere. The United States interprets secularism. So we have students who identify often through garments or other articles of faith that are visible. And so that, I think, adds to the rich diversity and pluralism on our campus. But those threads aren't apolitical in this day and age. Many of our students who display faith through articles of clothing, maybe they're Jewish students wearing a yarmulke, or Muslim students wearing a hijab, or Sikh students wearing a turban, oftentimes those students can become targets of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Sikh sentiment on campus. This is especially true for Muslim women who wear hijab and Sikh men who wear turban in a post-9/11 era. I know many of our students have parents who, after a terrorist attack around the world, will ask them to remove their article of faith out of concern for their own safety. And our students who continue to represent themselves through their articles of faith, I think, display tremendous moral courage. But once again, these aren't apolitical. Even if a student is wearing a article of faith because of their religious tradition or obligation or identity, other people might see that in different ways. And so what happens around the world happens on our campus. We have students representing over 120 different countries here. So we are always aware of what's happening around the world and how it will play out on our campus. And oftentimes, I think our students use their article of faith for very positive purposes. For example, we have Sikh students who have a wear a turban day, and a lot of non-Sikhs will wear a turban for a day and then meet with Sikh students and talk about what felt like, or wear a hijab for a day. A lot of non-Muslim women, at least once a semester, will get together with Muslim women and wear a hijab for a day and then meet up and talk about what their experiences were like. So on a campus, every opportunity should be an educational one, and oftentimes these conversations are very educational. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes they bring attention to students that isn't always positive, and so that's something that I'm aware of when I think about sacred threads on our campus. One final point is that on our campus we reflect the national American trend, which is that 20% of Americans are not formally affiliated with religion. Almost 40% of millennials or our students are not formally affiliated with religion, and almost 70% of our students describe themselves as more spiritual than religious. So I'm often thinking about, what does a new sacred space look like for a community that's not formally affiliated with religion? How do we use Trojan myths or ideas, or the notion of a Trojan family as a sacred community to talk about values and ethics, to talk about service and empathy, all of the things that our great faiths do, but to do it from the language of a secular research university. I draw very heavily upon the discourse of an American civil religion when I think about what that looks like on our campus. For those of you unfamiliar with the idea of a civil religion, that's the idea that our American political system in and of itself is a religion. When we go to vote, it's a sacred act. Our pilgrimages are to D.C. or to Mount Rushmore, etc. So that's an idea of America where the secular aspect that connects us with civil rituals becomes sacred. And I think we can think about civil religion as it applies on our campus through the Trojan family.
Thank you. My name is Edina Lekovic, and I formally work with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Informally, I work with a host of American Muslim national, regional, and local groups, both within the religious spaces in our communities and in the advocacy spaces within our communities. And interfaith fits in both of those categories. My background is actually in media and storytelling. My work as an American Muslim activist was an accidental journey because I started wearing hijab, or a headscarf, in college. I went to UCLA, don't hold it against me, across town. And I was my family, I should mention, sorry, I forget where I am. My family came from the former Yugoslavia. And so my family's been Muslim for generations. And often when people see my complexion or hear my voice, they can't quite compute how I'm Muslim. And in the space of thinking about sacred clothing, the way that I wear my sacred clothing, I often get mistaken for being an Orthodox Jewish woman rather than a Muslim. The lines between identities here in Los Angeles are often blurred, and the assumptions that people make can set them back rather than forward in many spaces. So we were cultural Muslims growing up, and when I was in college is when I went on my spiritual journey on a campus much like this one. And I went on my professional journey and my spiritual journey at the same time, only to feel that once I started to wear a hijab, that my choices became limited. Not because of who I was, but because of the symbolism of wearing your religion on your head, especially in a sphere like media. And this was in the late 90s, and so there really wasn't much space for that kind of work. So instead, my life took me in a direction of working in Muslim activism. The Muslim Public Affairs Council has worked to create a political and social voice, an interfaith voice for American Muslims since 1988. The American Muslim community is about 3.5 million people strong, just 1% of the overall U.S. population. We skew the youngest among all faith groups. 40% of American Muslims are under the age of 40. And we're also one of the fastest growing faiths within the country, both through conversion and through birth rates. Immigration or migration has less to do with it. And within the American Muslim community, we have the single largest group of American Muslims is African Americans, which is another space for misconceptions to take place, followed by South Asians, followed by Arabs, followed by people of other groups. We have Muslims from all around the world. So my experience with Muslims here in Los Angeles has reflected the global experience of Muslims. But working in Muslim advocacy has given me the lens to be able to see Muslim communities around the country and to also be a bridge builder. My work is in community building, so I work with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. I also work with an Islamic center called the Islamic Center of Southern California here in Los Angeles. That's one of the most pioneering mosques in America, and there are over 2,000 mosques across America. You might be surprised to know that one of the first and longest standing mosques in America is in Iowa. It's called the Mother Mosque of America, and it's in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So it's one of the first Muslim sacred spaces in the United States that continues to survive today. The sacred spaces that exist in Muslim communities are very diverse, and they are spaces that are not just for worship, but for communal gatherings, also for identity preservation, like many other sacred spaces. So they have many, many different functions. Core among them, like all sacred spaces, is the idea of awe and providing space for the life, engaging of meditation, of prayer, of self-renewal, of self-reflection that can take place. In mosques, this takes place in prayer that doesn't take place in pews. It takes place on open carpet, right, you might say, where people gather shoulder to shoulder or they sit alone and contemplate in prayer. Often the only issue in a mosque is calligraphy or mosaics or patterns. you don't see pictures necessarily. You won't see kinds of things. This becomes a calm, quiet place that's meant to help you turn inward when much of life is forward. And you Muslims pray 5 times a day. And they do have a mosque. So the mosque is a special sacred for average Muslim prayer. Prayer place in our corner office, the bed, and in our there might be any places for prayers. So in some ways, all space is sacred for a Muslim. Any place in the world can serve as a mosque, a place of prayer, if it's simply clean, so that you can remember God in that space with purity and cleanliness. And so mosques are supposed to reflect that kind of space. They're supposed to be open, beautiful, awe-inspiring places that are filled with people who are connected to one another. And yet mosques are also places of tension in America because of the political nature of to be an American Muslim today. So while these spaces are supposed to be sacred, our conversations within mosques are often interrupted or infused by politics, by Islamophobia, by xenophobia, by fear. Just last week, the Islamic Center of Southern California, the mosque I'm connected with, there was a local man who was arrested for making repeated death threats against staff at the Islamic Center. And badly enough that he was arrested, released on bail. They served a search warrant on his home and found over a dozen different kinds of weapons, over 200 pounds of ammunition. And so this man was ready and able to make good on his threat. Now, my community, in the aftermath of that, has to come back into a sacred space and to feel safe in that sacred space. It's maybe one of the things that's non-Judeo-Christian. I think many dogs face concerns around security, but particularly non-Judeo-Christian faiths and houses of worship face a particular kind of scrutiny or anxiety. And that's something that I see that has invaded many mosques, especially within the United States, which is what I'm most familiar with, is this sense of anxiety that has come to be connected to your spiritual life, sacred space, and your sacred clothing. That it takes courage to be faithful to your values. It takes courage to wear your sacred cloths out in public. It takes courage to say that you're a Muslim. And our sacred spaces are supposed to provide these kinds of sanctuaries, and for many people they do. But again, there are, in this day and age, we're seeing all kinds of attacks, arson attacks, vandalism, you name it, against mosques, let alone the kind of deadly threats that I just described to you. So there's a host of complex challenges that are out there. On the other hand, I want to also mention that for me, sacred space, and for many American Muslims, the sacred space of houses of worship, there exist in their lives beyond a mosque. American Muslims are heavily involved in interfaith engagement. If you go to a mosque, so the mosque to the affiliated Muslims, and they are probably 1 in 3 of American Muslims are affiliated with the mosque or go to a mosque on a regular basis. So we're right in line with other faiths in terms of more people being unaffiliated than being affiliated. But for those who go to mosques, 85% of them report being involved in interfaith engagement, civic engagement, of considering themselves American. So there's a positive relationship in accepting yourself and feeling pride in who you are because of this sacred space of a mosque, while there's also this anxiety and tension that exists. And because mosques are giving people opportunities to connect with other houses of worship, Muslims are getting access to multiple sacred spaces. And for me, and I hope there's space later to talk about this, for me that's part of where my faith has been elevated to new levels. Beyond my Muslim consciousness is in my exposure to other faiths and also other houses of worship. It has only elevated my own relationship to the divine. So the other piece that I want to talk about more is the sacred clothing. And there's nothing maybe as politicized as a hijab today to a woman's head covering. The stereotypes are abundant and apparent. I won't repeat them. But the lived reality of American Muslim women is the opposite of those stereotypes. American Muslim women are the second highest educated group of women in the United States. Less than half of women cover their hair in any way, and the hijab is supposed to be a symbol of modesty. This is a conference about symbolism and the power of symbolism. It's supposed to be a symbol of modesty so that a woman can be considered for her mind, for her intellect, rather than for her body or her sexuality. It's a way of publicizing your intellect and privatizing your sexuality in its purest sense. Now, does that happen everywhere? No, but I'll leave that for discussion later. But this is the idea behind the sacred clothing. It's supposed to be a reminder. And for me, the reason I decided to start wearing a hijab in college, and I wore it the more traditional way back then, was because I wanted to be identified as a Muslim. I wanted to wear my faith more openly. I knew that I could pass as somebody who wasn't Muslim. I didn't have to wear it on my sleeve, but I opted in because I wanted to represent the kind of Muslim women that I knew existed all around me every day. And so the past 20 years of my journey have been about amplifying more voices and creating more paths for young American Muslims to find their way to be able to be in media, in government, in Hollywood, and to be changing conditions so that when I was 22, I thought my career ended before it started, and I instead realized that again, as we're all believers, right, that a new opportunity was awoken out of the personal experience that I had, and so much of my journey has been elevated by both sacred spaces and sacred clothing, while it has also been extremely challenged by. The last thing I want to say about hijab is that we know it's also a political symbol that has subjected women to all kinds of violence, and we're seeing all kinds of hate crimes that are taking place, particularly against Muslim women in hijab. And yet, there are also breakthrough opportunities that were not there 20 years ago when I was a young hijabi. The first American Muslim woman in hijab competed on behalf of the United States in the Olympics this summer, Ibtihaj Muhammad. CoverGirl just named an American Muslim woman as an ambassador, a beauty ambassador who wears a hijab. H&M has featured Muslim women in hijab in their advertising. Now we're being commodified, we're being valued, right, for our consumer dollars. There's a breakthrough here, and it is in some ways too slick to identify as something spiritual, but because of the acceptance and the valuing, it is elevating us into a new normal, and we need normalization more than anything else. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Those were terrific. Thank you. So my name is Patrick Mason. I am less of a religious leader per se, but more my community primarily is academic, although I'm an active and believing and practicing member of my community, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I hold, it's called the Howard W. Hunter Chair in Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about Mormonism academically as well as living it out personally. So I want to offer just a few reflections about sacred space, sacred clothing in the Mormon tradition. But I also, in addition to my work in Mormon studies, and I'm an American religious historian, I also have done some work over the years in the field of religion, conflict, and peace building. So I'm interested in the ways that the sacred space and sacred clothing become sites of tension and conflict. I think we're going to be talking about that a little bit more. I did my graduate work at the University of Notre Dame. So while I feel very comfortable in a Catholic space like this, I feel USC is somewhat less of a sacred space than other places I would be. I feel very threatened here by the Trojan ideals But I'm speaking of sacred space. I'm reminded there's a crucifix over the door. When I was at Notre Dame in the master's degree in peace studies program, we had students from all over the world, and one of my close friends and peers in the program was an Orthodox Jew from Jerusalem, came from a long line of Orthodox rabbis. And his family was very worried about sending him to the University of Notre Dame for an education. This was not what good Jewish boys did. And so we went, and we were in classrooms, and every classroom had a crucifix like this. And after the first week or two, he called home, and his mother kind of worriedly said, how are things going? How are they treating you? And he said, He says, "Oh, Mom, it's great. Everybody is so polite. Everybody is so nice. And in fact, they're so nice, they have a Jew hanging on every wall." So the Mormon experience with sacred space has been an interesting one. As most of you will know, Mormonism was born in the United States. So it was born in early 19th century America in upstate New York. And then because of conflicts with their neighbors, the religion and the movement was forced to move from New York to Ohio to Missouri to Illinois and then to Utah. And then from there, it's spread around the world. But in each of those places, there was a sense that this could be a place of worship. This could be a place where this new movement, the sense of new revelation from God, could take root. And because of conflict with their neighbors, oftentimes they were forced to be uprooted and forced to move. But very early in the movement, Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of Mormonism, he had declared by revelation that Missouri, a particular place in western Missouri, represented an especially sacred place that related to both the beginnings of the earth with the Garden of Eden, but also with the end times and when Jesus would come to the earth. And so there was a sense that for Mormons that Missouri, this very particular place, we typically, when we think of sacred spaces, we often think of Jerusalem, we think of Rome, we think of these places that are of Mecca and Medina, these places with centuries history. Joseph Smith, by fiat, by revelation, said, no, this place in western Missouri, totally undeveloped, on the frontier, this is sacred space. And so I think what Mormonism does and what religions oftentimes do, we have to remember that sacred spaces, they aren't always sacred. Somebody made them sacred, right? Something happened in that place. Either a sacred word was spoken or some kind of sacred act occurred. Some kind of eruption of the divine into the terrestrial that made that place sacred and that made a community of faith, a community of believers, sense that this place is holy. This is a place where heaven touched earth, and there is a sense that we can approach heaven by communing in this place. Now, it can create a lot of conflict, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And I actually think there's real problems associated with any particular community locating and saying this ground, however demarcated, is sacred, and in fact, it's our sacred space, meaning it's not your sacred space. That becomes a real problem. It was a problem in Mormon history. I can share more details later. And so there's a sense that especially if many Eastern traditions and Native American and other indigenous traditions have a sense that if you can't make it, you can't own it. And so land was not made by us. And so it's difficult for us to say we own it. Right? And now, of course, we have a tradition in the Euro-American legal tradition and so forth that we could own private property. This goes against many traditions still today, and of course many historic traditions. But this can become a problem with sacred space when we draw a line and say this is sacred and it's ours. And there's a scarcity, a sense of competition that can sometimes be imbued with space. Now, Mormons forced to leave Missouri and then Illinois and then moved to Utah. And Utah does not operate as sacred space quite the same way that Missouri does in the Mormon imagination, but it's where the church headquarters was set up and still is today, and where it's the largest single Latter-day Saint community still in Utah. So there is a kind of sacredness there, partly by virtue of the concentration of the community, by the history that is there, this sacred history of Mormon pioneers coming and settling into what they considered to be a wilderness. We have to keep in mind that in order for them to set up a new sacred community, they had to displace other people who were already there. And so that many of those people had their own sacred places. And when Mormons came into into what is now called Utah and set up their community, they displaced others as well. So we have to think about what one person's sacred space might mean for other communities that preceded them and maybe still act as neighbors. But for Mormons, the most sacred places are, and they began building these in Ohio, tried to build one in Missouri, built in Illinois, and then in Utah, and now around the world, are temples. And these, unlike the regular buildings that Mormons worship in every Sunday, temples are reserved only for the faithful, only for those who subscribe to core Mormon beliefs and live their lives in a certain way to meet standards of what Mormons call worthiness. But these temples become places not only of reflection and of worship, but also where Mormons make sacred covenants or promises with God. There is a very real sense, at the heart of Mormon theology is a sense that God and humans are ontologically more similar than different. And so, therefore, temples become the place where humans access divinity and, in fact, learn the lessons that help them prepare for it. And so they become very powerful places for reflection. They are quiet. They are given towards reflection and to prayer, but also there's a ritual aspect where Mormons go into these spaces to enter into a kind of sacred and cosmic drama and to recognize not only the dignity but the divinity of their lives. So this space provides a kind of place where Mormons can transcend the kind of mundaneness of everyday life and enter into a kind of higher sense of reality. And then hopefully the idea is that they can bring that sense of divinity back into their ordinary lives. And one of the ways that they do this is sacred or sacred clothing. So Mormons who have been initiated in the religion's temples come back having been clothed in sacred undergarments. And so Mormons do not wear sacred garments on the exterior, but most Mormons, including myself, wear sacred undergarments. And now these are sometimes derided and mocked, like other forms of sacred clothing. People joke about magic underwear and things like this. But in fact, for Mormons, this sense of wearing a sacred vestment on the inside, I think clothes them with divinity. It clothes them with the sense that God has given us the gift of life. And he calls us all to be priests and priestesses. This is one of the fundamental teachings of Mormon temples, is there's a kind of democratization of sacred authority, that everybody can access the divine and operate in divine fashion and with divine authority as priests and priestesses. And so they leave the temple having been clothed in these sacred garments or vestments which remind them of their priest or priestesshood. And they take that into the world, and that's their daily lives. That brings an aura of the sacred into all the things they do in their families, in their workplace, in their civic duties, and so forth. They do all of this as priests and priestesses who have been initiated in God's temples. So there's a very powerful sense in Mormon theology and Mormon ritual that God reaches down and touches and graces us, that he gives us daily reminders, and that most of all these bodies that we inhabit are sacred spaces themselves. The gift of life becomes the most sacred that is given us. And so the sacred garment that we put on them remind us of the sacredity of the body, which hopefully gives us a sense of respect for other people's bodies as well, not just our own. And every body is a gift from God. So I'll stop there.
Good evening. My name is Pastor E. Wayne Gatz. I am the pastor of the Missionary Baptist Church and also the president of the California Missionary Baptist State Convention here in the California area, from San Diego to Sacramento, which we have approximately 253 churches under our leadership. I am here, and I'm really grateful for the panel that has been here, and I've enjoyed listening to them, and I've enjoyed what I've heard so far. And I want to thank those who are responsible for me being here today. I have a very passionate concern and love for our Mormon brothers and sisters. The last several years I have been in mingling and co-mingling with them, and I truly thank God for the gift and the relationship that we has developed. And being a Baptist pastor, that is very strange within itself. And and I tell you the reason why it is very strange is simply because we have thought that that would never be the difference when black Baptists can be in the presence of Mormons and call each other brothers and sisters. And we have found out differently that we have more in common than we have out of common. So I'm just grateful to God to be in the fellowship. Sacred place and sacred space is nothing but your sacred place, which simply means that it is a space or place that you have chosen where you can communicate with your God or gods. In being connected with God, we all need a sacred place for more reason than one. Now, I mean, you all may not know it, but it's dangerous to give a black Baptist preacher a mic. You may not know it, but it's dangerous to give us a mic because we'll take a text and we'll go on and on. We've got to make it brief. But one of the things about sacred place, sacred space, is the fact that it is where human and divine can come together, can connect. I'm grateful that this is an interfaith because in studying and in listening to our brothers and our sisters earlier, it is very important that everybody have their sacred space, simply because of the fact that we all need to communicate with our God. Our world is in attack today as religious belief, and especially our Mormon brothers and sisters, they're under attack because of the way they believe, and they have been misconstrued by those that are non-believers in what they believe in. But being a Baptist, I believe in Ephesians 4:5-6 that there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God of all of us. And God has given us all a choice to serve him, or we don't have to serve him. You can be a Christian or you can be a non-Christian. But what in my practice and in my study, yes, we have chosen to accept our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, number one, as our Savior. Our sacred place has, some call them temples, some call them mosques, some call them a church. However, I believe that in the church. I believe in the church being in the body of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ as it relates to what I believe and who I believe in. And I believe that he is the Savior of the world. Yes, we all have our different belief, but in my religion, we believe that everybody ought to be respected for what they believe and who they believe in. So therefore, do we have a rock to throw at a glass house? No, we do not. Simply because of the fact that there are some of our beliefs that I don't believe in, which I serve in. So, and what I mean by that is simply because of the fact that everyone believe what their heart tells them to believe. And if I can look at my brothers and sisters as to who they are and respect them for what they believe in, who they are, in trying to make our world better, that's what I believe in. If we are going in our sacred spaces and we are not seeking to make our community, make our world better, I feel that we're all doing it in vain. So therefore, my belief in my teaching and my practices as to the group that I lead, our main desire, we are trying to make our world, our community better. And how do we make them better? By joining forces with those that have the same belief or similar belief as to where we are trying to go to be able to build the better character of individuals. I was fortunate enough to be in a couple of meetings with Elder Uthoff, I believe, when he dedicated the John Widtsoe Foundation. And I was so impressed with the man. I wanted to go back to Germany with him. I was so impressed. And one of the things that he said, and I never will forget it, he said, regardless of what you believe in, if we believe in God, you got to understand that we have more in common. And if we can look at individuals and see how much we really have in common, and there's not much different, simply because we all have our sacred space. And in our sacred space, and this is where the Baptists come out of me, in our sacred space, you'll be surprised as to what you can find in your sacred space, wherever it is, whether it's your mosque, whether it's your temple, whether it's your chapel, whether it's your church. You would be surprised that in your sacred space, how peaceful it is, how much love you can pull out of your sacred space, how much joy you can pull out of your sacred space. But not only that, but in your sacred space, you can find out that we all are God's children. We all are God's people, and we're working for one common goal, and that is to strengthen our brothers and sisters. So I'm really grateful that this is an interfaith, simply because of the fact we have to learn how to respect one another's belief. We have to learn how to respect how each other feel, and most of all, how they worship. And their clothing, now, we don't have no particular clothing that we wear that we call sacred. We believe that everything that we do is in the heart. But however, we have to learn, and we do learn, how to respect those that have their sacred clothing. So once again, in my closing, I want to say that we all are believers of something, of someone, of something. And the best thing we can do is learn how to respect others in their belief. Thank you so very much.
Well, if it's not a good idea to give a mic to a Baptist preacher, I'm a Methodist preacher. And we go on for much longer, but I won't. First of all, sacred spaces. I better tell you, first of all, I've been a Methodist preacher for over 30 years, and I've also been the tutor for trainee preachers in our area, which is the area around the city of Derby in the middle of England. Our system is that we go round different churches every Sunday, which can be quite useful because it means you can use a sermon more than once. But you do have to write on the back where you have used it, because some people listen and they might say, we've heard this before. So you go around a lot of places and you see a lot of much loved sacred places. We don't go in for big posh status buildings. In the area where I go around, a lot of it is former mining areas, so the chapels are quite small. We have some new ones on the newer housing estates. They're modern and more spacious and have rather nicer lavatories, but it's part of the job. But if you go to the older areas, you find these little chapels, and the first thing that strikes you about them is that these are very special places. They've obviously been loved. And you go into these quite small chapels, and they will have ordinary chairs and ordinary table. There's a special table, holy table at the front. There's often a massive pulpit, because that's why we're there. And you will find around the place mementos of families. This vase was given in memory of so-and-so who served this church for 70 years, or whatever it was. You'll find a lot of needlework done by the women of the place, embroideries, some of them very old indeed. So the chapels are like homes. They're always spotless. The brasses are cleaned. There's this kind of smell of furniture polish about this. They're obviously much loved places. We don't have rituals of genuflection or wearing special clothes. I'll come to that in a minute. But chapels are places. They can be rather cold, so you do have to wear what we call suitable clothing. Otherwise, you can't preach if you're shivering. And attached to a chapel, invariably, there will be a hall, which historically is called the schoolroom, because this was used for educational purposes. It's been used for a lot of other things as well. You have old people's luncheon clubs, you have play groups for children, you have centres where separated couples can meet and collect their children if they're, allowed to have them for one day a week. All these sort of things that kind of make life a little bit easier. So that's our sacred spaces. They're really homes to those communities, and they're warm and they're welcoming. There's always a kitchen, because Methodists drink a lot of tea, and we're noted for drinking lots of tea. If you go to the Methodist Museum in the centre of London, and you go and you go to the tea room, obviously, you will find that the souvenir napkins served with tea are embellished in the corner with a picture of John Wesley's teapot in blue, because blue is our colour. So sacred spaces, they're much loved little homes. Sacred garments, we tend to wear those only when going out visiting. If I'm preaching in a Methodist church, except on a very special occasion, for example, next Sunday, Remembrance Sunday in England, when we have the poppies and all that, then we would wear our black preaching gowns. I've got a ferocious-looking black Geneva gown, and it is enormous, and you do have to be careful not to knock things off as you go past or trip as you're going upstairs. But you see, if I'm out doing a formal preaching somewhere, 2 weeks ago I was preaching in a college in Oxford. I have actually preached in Westminster Abbey, and then it would be quite wrong to turn up just in sort of decent Sunday clothing. So when we're out in a public place not our own, then we do tend to wear something really to conform with the environment that we're going into. Now, we don't have any visible signs of what we are. There's no Methodist equivalent of the turban, although until fairly recently, you could spot, as you were driving to church on a Sunday morning, you could spot who was going to chapel, because there'd be ladies in very sensible hats and walking in one direction. Methodists are more easy to spot, rather in the places where you will find them. We have this called mission alongside, and congregations are disproportionately presented in what is called uncommonly doing good. And so we have big involvement in the cities, not of homeless. We were pioneers for women's refuge in Britain. We have one within our own area. We have a live at home scheme for older people so that we can go and call on them. Welfare care is very, very expensive in England. So we have things like this, and our visible signs really is lifestyle rather than a particular sort of hat or whatever it is. So we don't have, and because of the situation in England, we don't have a need to say, we are this group, we are that, because we're extremely well known. But that said, if you look at traditional Methodist hymns like those written by Charles Wesley, if you go through them, you will find they are full of what I call temple theology. It's quite surprising. We don't kind of dress our buildings up to look like temples, but we do actually shape our worship around that pattern. One of the things that I have to do when I'm training Methodist preachers, and the word we use is enabling, you enable them to meet their call, is how you create the sense of a sacred situation simply by the words you use, your demeanour as you are leading public worship, the music you choose, the whole package, because we actually compose and write a package every week. I have to work within very strict limits. A lot of our people get on transport. And in England, the hourly Sunday bus service is something you have to work with, and if you run over, you're going to wait another before you get home. So we have a lot of very practical considerations, but part of the task of the preacher is to create by the words and by your sense, by how you act, a sense that even in this little tiny chapel, nothing very grand, this actually is a temple.
Well, thank you for introducing yourselves, and let me remind you that if you'd like to ask any of them a question and would like to fill in one of the cards, please do so, and we'll bring it up and use that. But I'd like to, while we're waiting for those cards to come up, to ask a question, picking up on something that Margaret was saying there about how do you create a sense of the sacred in your community, or how can we do a better job of making people more aware of what it means to appreciate and respect and protect sacred space and sacred behavior. As kind of a background, let me comment that as I've listened to a lot of the papers in this conference, I'm struck by some very natural oppositions, some conflicts, some tensions that inevitably are going to exist in any discussion of something that is sacred. You can't have something that is sacred unless there's something that is unsacred or unholy. What's the line between those two? You cannot have something that is heavenly unless there is something that is earthly, the sacred and the sacral or secular. We've talked about some of our speakers who have talked about how there are certain things that they're just hardwired, that they need. And others say anything you want, or just be as fluid or flowing as you want as water coming out of the temple. What is it? Is it firm or is it not? We have some who have talked about certain things that cause things to be sacred. Other things that become sacred as a result of the influence of sacred things around them. We had some who talk about ritual, creating sacred space, but at the same time, sacred space creating ritual. We are, in some senses, finite, of course, in all senses finite, although maybe have a spark of the infinite in us. But how do we then relate as finite beings to something that is eternal and infinite? It's another conflict that we have to address. We all need a sacred space. Do we then all need an unsacred space? Well, we have community, we have individuals. All of these tensions create opportunities for us to differentiate and to understand. If we didn't have any distinction, I mean, if we were all in this room and it was totally black, we couldn't see a thing. It was totally white. We also couldn't see anything. You couldn't even see the corners in the room. It's only by differentiating degrees and colors of light that we can perceive anything. In the Book of Mormon, we have one line that I think is really important for understanding our sense of cosmology and who we are and why we're here. It's one little line that says, "There needs must be an opposition in all things." There's good and evil. There's heaven and hell. There's God and Satan. However you describe them, there are these oppositions. I think are yearning for something to handle that tension. Now, let me just end with one other comment, which I hope will then be a question. Tension can be either good or bad. Just like any tool. A hammer can be used to build up or tear down. Exactly the same. Is a hammer morally, not even morally neutral. It's not moral or ethical until it has a hand put to it that uses it in some way. And then it becomes an instrument of morality. So take a violin as an example. You cannot make music on a violin unless the strings are in tension. And you can't make much music if you've only got one string. But at the same time, if you have too much tension, I know if I've got too much tension on my banjo, the string breaks. So how do we go about dealing with these tensions and these oppositions? And how do you, in your work in communities, convince especially our young people that these tensions can be balanced? And how do you convince them that having a role for sacred things in their life is worthwhile, that it's important, that it's like you learned, Adina, in college, that it's something that you want to stand up for? But how do we pass that on to people that we want to influence and want to help them to do as much as possible to live a life that they will feel is pleasing to God? Comments on that? And maybe should we start at that end?
Jack, I would like to say to the panel, I would like to say that one of the biggest problem that I see as it relates to tension with religions and sacred places, lack of understanding and lack of education of one another as to where they are trying to go. And I know, as you were stating about too much tension on a guitar string or violin, it could break. But one of the things that we also have to look at is there's where the scripture also talks about you reap what you sow. That can be looked at. A lot of people look at it in a negative, but also it can be looked at in a positive as well. If you sow good things, you certainly are going to be looking to reap good things. And if you put the right tension on the right thing as it relates to other denomination, others' belief, and others' sacred threads or their sacred places, I really feel and believe that others will be able to, once they understand, then the tension could be eased up as it relates to.
Yeah, and I think you asked a lot of questions, Jack. So, well, yeah, exactly. So I do want to think a little bit about the tension around sacred spaces. And while they are places of awe and worship, and they are life-affirming, they also become sites of tension, sometimes within groups, sometimes between groups. I'm mindful that just this past week, for instance, there was a Black Baptist church in Mississippi that was burned by an arsonist and vandalized with graffiti that said "Vote Trump" on it, and I think that cast aspersions on the particular political kit. But as we see sacred spaces, it's certainly been mosques after September 11th. Mormon temples and churches have been places of protest, conflict, and this is true of sacred spaces around this country, a country that's, we like to say, is founded upon religious tolerance and is within our constitutional system. Somehow our culture doesn't always live up to our constitutional ideals. And so so these are places of tension, and I think we have to think about the ways that our sacred places reflect either a particularism and a parochialism, or whether we can use those sacred places to be inviting places where we can reflect on the sacredness of all humanity. So one of my favorite verses in Mormon scripture, as I talked about earlier, Missouri had been designated, or this particular place in Missouri had been designated by a revelation of Joseph Smith as Zion, as this place for gathering for the saints. And one of the problems that Mormons had is then they came in and said, hey, this is our land, it's not your land. Woody Guthrie had a song about that later on, sort of countering that. He was actually responding to Irving Berlin's God Bless America. So we have to think about the sacred nation, and that means that's for another time. But so there was a sense among many Mormons that this is our space. God has given this to us. It's ours, not yours. But in a word of revelation from God, this is what he said about this space that they thought he had given just to them. He said, "And it shall be called the New Jerusalem, a land of peace, a city of refuge, a place of safety for the saints of the Most High God. And it shall come to pass among the wicked that every man that will not take sword against his neighbor must needs flee unto Zion for safety. And there shall be gathered unto it out of every nation under heaven, and it shall be the only place that shall not be at war one with another." And so I read this as God saying to these people, I didn't give you this land so that you could fight with your neighbors, or that you could drive them out, or you could establish some kind of preeminence that I love you more than I love everybody else. I gave you this land to proclaim peace to your neighbors, to invite everyone who wants to flee from the violence of the world, the sectarianism of the world, all of the kinds of conflicts of the world. He says, I want you to be an ensign to the people, where people can come to this place and learn peace. And so can we make our sacred spaces places of citizenness for all people, where we reflect the dignity of all people, rather than simply saying this is ours and there's a kind of scarcity of divine love and favor? I think that's the challenge that we face in any of our sacred spaces. Yes, they're meaningful to us. They're the place where we tell stories. They're the place where we build identities that are special to us and connect to history and to ancestors and to stories that are meaningful to us. But how can we not turn that into a kind of violence against the other, a kind of chauvinism where God has shown us more favor than them? I think that's the challenge that any sacred space.
When I think tensions exist for young American Muslims, there are plenty that have to do with their identity and the place that a mosque even has in their life and whether it's relevant. And I think that many of the reasons that it is difficult for young American Muslims to connect to mosque life has to do with the ability of mosque leadership to embrace tension or ignore tension. And it seems to be one of the two are usually dominant. And so the places where within our faith there are spaces of tension that can hopefully lead to progress, and that's where I do believe that tension is positive, right? The challenge is, how do we hold our faith principles true and be civil and allow for the differences even inside of our faiths, and rather than just focusing on, we can get along with others, right? Sometimes we can make it a lot easier to get along with others than our own even. And that's something that I've seen over and over again at New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Changes. We do these fellowships, and people often have more tension with other Muslims and other Jews rather than between each other. So the issues that come to mind inside of mosques, the first is gender. Muslims in mosque life are co-ed except for during prayer. So within prayer, men pray together and women pray together all at the same time, but you stand gender segregated. All other time in mosque life is gender integrated, and that's by design, as it's supposed to be. But there are many mosques that have taken the practice of gender segregation that exists within prayer and have made it the standard within mosque life outside of prayer. And this creates tension, right? And this is also the tension between culture and faith that many houses of worship face. And for young people especially, so we don't have women imams in our tradition, in the mainstream tradition. And so you hear women as educators and in other spaces, but you don't hear sermons necessarily, from women. And so this can create a dynamic. And if you take that dynamic and you universalize it within the mosque rather than particularize it for religious services and sermons, you create a culture that says that there is gender inequality rather than gender equity. And young people, again, this is the antenna are up. A second thing is the sectarian differences. Sunni, Shia, Sufi, Salafi, I don't know why they all begin with S's somehow. But we have sects, different approaches to faith within our community, and the minorities get persecuted. Shias make up 10 to 15% of Muslims worldwide, and make no doubt about it, they are persecuted in many places, bad enough that they have fled Muslim majority countries for the persecution that they have received. And many of those sub-communities under the Shia community, like Ismailis or Ahmadis, I'm forgetting others, have responded by turning inward, by creating the kind of protected sacred spaces that I believe that temples hold, and that other spaces do, where other Muslims can't come into those spaces because they are meant to be safe space for this persecuted minority within Islam. So that's also a tension. The last one is a intellectual tension. The Quran embraces the idea of critical thinking. We're told there's this word in Arabic, tadabbur, that we're supposed to think and rethink and rethink. And yet the dominant narrative in Islamic interpretation is that the Quran is fixed rather than flexible. And that's not because the Quran describes itself that way. It's because that's what the majority, the recognized, respected majority of scholarship, mostly done by males, has produced over 15 centuries. When you look at the Quran, the idea of critical thinking and the Quran being a message for all times and all places is that's the thing that matters, that diversity is part of Islam, and that Islam is supposed to be practiced in a way that is relevant for each time and each place in which it is lived. So these are some of the internal tensions that I think are hopefully creating progress, because people are having to engage in the battle place of ideas. And I think that's what our young people are looking for, is open dialogue, open debate around these issues, rather than silence, right, or than resistance to even addressing the tensions.
I'm going to start with Jack's first question about how does one's community create the conditions for sacred space, reflection, etc. I'm going to answer it from the perspective not of a multi-religious Trojan family, but from the perspective of my own American Hindu tradition. What's different about Hinduism as opposed to the other faiths represented here is that Hinduism is not an Abrahamic tradition. It's part of the so-called Dharma traditions that come out of South Asia, the four uniquely Indian religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. And just as Judaism, Christianity, Islam share a common theological framework, so too do these traditions. And one of the things that's different about these traditions as opposed to the Abrahamic traditions is that our traditions aren't focused, don't believe in linear time. Rather, we believe in cyclical time. So there's no beginning of time, there's no end of time. Time is in a cycle like the seasons. The universe contracts and expands over time. That's what our origin story is. And because of that, we also believe in reincarnation, that our soul is reincarnated over many lifetimes until it achieves liberation from the cycle of suffering, liberation from the cycle of rebirth. For Buddhists, that's called nirvana. For Hindus, that's called moksha, that once our soul, which is a reflection of God, achieves liberation, then our soul becomes one with God. So we believe that our souls, everyone has an individual soul, and that soul is a reflection of a bigger soul, an oversoul, Godhead, cosmic consciousness, etc., and that the soul yearns to be with God. And if we cultivate the right action, the right knowledge, the right devotion, the right contemplation in our life, then we can achieve liberation between lifetimes and become one with God. That's why if you go to a yoga class, you might be greeted with the traditional Hindu greeting of namaste. Namaste literally means the divinity within me acknowledges and salutes the divinity within you. Just within a Hindu greeting, you see a core theological concept, very different than the Western greeting of a handshake: I have no weapon, I will not kill you. Because of that, temple life is oriented around something different. The goal of Hindu liberation is really to understand your own divinity, not that you are God, but that you have God within you. That's why you see animals depicted as the divine in India. When people go to India and they come back and say, why do you worship the cow or the snake or the elephant, etc.? It's not that the cow is God or the elephant's God or the snake is God or the monkey is God. It is that there is God in the cow, in the snake, in the elephant, in the monkey. That's why many Hindus are vegetarian, because it's not just humans who have an inherently divine nature. It's all sentient beings that have an inherently divine nature. So the goal is to awaken the inner divinity within us, to understand our natures are inherently divine. That means the goal is more of a contemplative, inward process as opposed to something that's externally facing. We have to look into God, not out. That's why Hindu practice is so focused and Buddhist practice is so focused on meditation, contemplation, prayer, etc., an inward introspective process. When you go into a Hindu temple, the goal is really to awaken the inner divinity within you, the inner divine divine consciousness within you. And according to Hindu traditions, we have 6 sense doors. The 5 that I think we all know about: sight, taste, touch, smell, hearing, etc. And then the last one for Hindus is the mind. The mind itself is a sense door to a particular type of consciousness. So when you go into a Hindu temple, it's very different than other houses of worship because, like Hinduism itself, it's kind of a disorganized, chaotic scene. And you have, within the temple setting, within the worship setting, spiritual technology that are aimed at activating the divine consciousness within you through your sense doors. So there'll be a bell ringing. That opens up your hearing. The incense is burning. That opens up your smell. It's a spectacle of sound or of sight. That opens up your eyes. You're looking at images of the divine. The mantra recitation or the recitation of prayer opens up your mind. The congregational nature of worship opens up the sense of touch. So it's a full sensory experience and overload by design. If you've ever gone to a Hindu temple or gone to India, it's hard not to see the spectacle of devotion in Hindu religious life. And it's there by design, to really use what's outside of you to awaken what's inside of you. So I think that in our tradition, the connection between what's happening externally in temple life and what's happening internally in terms of your own consciousness is explicit. And that the external kinds of rituals of the world are really meant to awaken the internal potentiality towards liberation that all of us possess. In terms of the tension, I think what is also different from Hinduism as opposed to the other traditions up here is that we're not a transnational religion. There are many Muslim majority countries. There are many Christian majority countries. And even now, we're at a point where Mormonism there are more Mormons outside the U.S. than inside the U.S., even though it's a uniquely American religion in many ways. Hinduism is very different. There are only 2 Hindu majority countries in the world, India and Nepal. 99 of Hindus live in India. So when we think about what Hinduism looks like in a diasporic context, we begin to see some of these tensions play out. And we also see how we look to India as a sacred site to recreate wherever we're at. And I'll give you 2 examples of this. One is, if you've ever been to the Malibu Temple in Malibu on Las Virgenes Drive near Pepperdine, it's a beautiful Hindu temple. It's one of my favorite in the United States. It took a long time to build. And it's really interesting because it's modeled after Tirupati-nath, which is the holiest Hindu temple in India. It's the 2nd biggest religious institution in the world after the Vatican. It's a huge temple complex. And Tirupati refers to the Lord of 7 hills. So in Malibu, the Hindu community 30 years ago found a place that is surrounded by 7 hills. And they put the temple in this place because it looks like the topography of the main temple in India. They brought the artisans and the priests who were trained at this temple to create the temple here. The priests who run the worship ceremony at the temple in Malibu are trained at the temple in India, in Tirupati. In many ways, it's a recreation of an ancient and significant Hindu temple complex right here in the United States. What's unique about it, though, and this plays to some of the tensions of a diasporic community, is that in India, you will find a temple to Vishnu or Shiva or the goddess. And depending on who or how you worship, you will attend one of those temples. But in the diaspora, we have to cater to all Indians, all Hindus, and we don't have a critical mass to just say, I am a worshiper of Vishnu or Shiva or the goddess. It's, I am a Hindu. And so what you find at the Malibu temple is a Vishnu temple side by side with a Shiva temple. You would never see that in India, but you see it right here in Malibu because it's a way to capture all the Hindus in the community, not just those who specify with one tradition or another, because we're not a critical mass in the United States. We're even less than 1% of the population. There are about 1.82 million Hindus in the United States. So in some ways, the Malibu Temple is a recreation of an ancient complex. In other ways, it's a reimagining of what temple worship looks like in a new context. Another example, which is a stunning new temple in Chino Hills, it's called the Baps Temple, B-A-P-S. I'd suggest you check it out if you get a chance. It's the most beautiful temple I've ever seen in the United States. When they wanted to build it there, though, the Hindu community bought all this land. They wanted to build it. There was tremendous opposition from Chino Hills as a city. Citizens were against it. The city council was against it. I don't know why they wanted to build in this particular plot. It seems kind of random to me. It's like in a strip mall. It's like, but they were not deterred. They spent years lobbying the city council, years making relationships with their neighbors. They had to wait till other city council members retired and were replaced by others who were more sympathetic to their cause. Finally, they got the approval to build after 5 years of intense sort of public diplomacy. The temple is spectacular. I can't tell you enough how gorgeous it is. It took 1,500 artisans 3 years working full-time to carve this temple out of marble and out of wood. And they carved it in India, they brought it over here, and they established it. Now this temple has become a center for Chino Hills, Hindu or not. When the mayor brings in international guests, he brings them to the temple. When civic groups want to show off their to the temple. When community members want to do events, they rent space from the temple. It's become a part of the fabric of the community itself. And in many ways, I think the temple organizers were prescient in building those kinds of interfaith relationships, those civic relationships, those political relationships, so that when the temple was finally established, it would be established in a context that really cherished the temple. Not just the Hindus cherishing it, but the non-Hindus as well. So I think these two examples, the Malibu Hindu Temple and the Baptist Temple in Chino Hills, give us a sense of tension that happens in a diasporic context, especially from a tradition like Hinduism that's not a transnational tradition.
Okay, I'll take this down to Margaret. And thank you for mentioning law. As a lawyer, I always look for lawsuits that might be happening. And building temples and property always raises that kind of thing. And so that's one more of those tensions. I don't know how many of you have followed what's been going on with the United Nations and UNESCO and their determination that the Temple Mount in Jerusalem has no relevance to Judaism any longer. Have you heard of that? I mean, there were over 50 nations voting on that matter. Only 6 voted against it, about half abstained. But when we think about sacred space, we can't ignore the conflict between the public sphere, the legal sphere, and our desires in the sacred. But that's another conference. Margaret?
Right. I'm going to go back to where we were when we started this second thing. The idea of tensions that exist. In my community, we have been a predominantly Methodist village for over 200 years. The tensions that we have in the community are over silly things like introducing a new hymn book and that type of thing. Now, you're all familiar with that. Or trying a new tune for a well-known hymn, and people say, well, no, it's the tune we like. You know, we don't mind changing the words, but we must keep the tune. So we don't actually experience these sort of tensions, which are the result of a society moving around and changing. Another thing is that we don't actually, our style of doing things isn't spectacular. So our idea of the sacred is something that is immediately attainable to anybody who is familiar with the interior of an English home. And this is a very good thing because people do actually feel at home. The ubiquitous cup of tea and the sort of things that they remind them a little bit of their granny, perhaps, around the place. We have churches where there's collections of souvenir Methodist plates on the wall, fond of our souvenir plates. But when you get to working in difficult areas, for example, some of our, I believe you call it downtown, we call it city centre churches, where we're dealing with the homeless, with the addicts and things like that. We have a mantra which is belong, believe, behave, in that order. And people come in because they know what it's like to be utterly alone and utterly desolate and on their own. And they find, they can sleep in the church hall, they can have a wash, they can have a meal. People who talk to them. This is something that people really, really want. They want to talk to another human being. And then they come and they find themselves part of a Christian community and they learn about it. And then, and some of the preachers I've been training recently are much involved in this work. They say then they start learning how to behave. and getting terribly cross when they start using bad language, and they're cross with themselves. Or when one of our preachers was recently accompanying one of these new people to a court hearing. She went just to be with him. And he was met by a drug pusher, and he just said, I don't need that stuff anymore, I've got Jesus now. And this was lovely. Now, this was never said to him, you've got to stop this, you've got to stop that. But he realised that his new family lived in a certain way. And there were certain things that his new friends really wouldn't want him to be doing. And this happens time and time again. So I think we avoid a lot of the conflict and the tension simply by being so very ordinary. And people, feel at home. And Methodist ministers and preachers look like members of the human race. We don't have things that set us apart, except we are countercultural in many, many ways, because we oppose a lot of things that we don't like happening in our society. Domestic violence, for example. We were pioneers in taking a stand against that. So I think it's our ordinariness that enables us to be sacred in a very, very secular world.
There's also something about being ordinary that is orderly, which I think is the epitome of being British, right? Great. Well, let me say one of the comments came in, Reverend Gaddis. A big shout out, thank you for the choir last night. We go now into the final question, and we have about 10 minutes, maybe 12. I'll say 10 minutes because I know it'll go a little longer. So we're going into the 2-minute drill. Tomorrow is the USC football game. Excuse me. But it's a football game tomorrow, and you know that a football game, when you get to the last 2 minutes, it takes about 40 minutes to play. None of you can push the timeout button, okay? No timeouts left. No commercial break, right? But here, let me just ask you to be really concise. Think hard about how you might boil down what I might call the terrible questions, the existential questions. How does what we have been talking about the sacred in any respect, help us to understand who we are as human beings, how we connect to each other, what our rights and our duties are, how we relate to God, or how we relate to other people. Why are we here? Where are we going? How does sacred help us, help you? 2 minutes. We'll start here, Varun, with you, and on down, Margaret, give you the last word. No, we'll come down this way. You got the first, you got the last.
I'll put on my Dean of Religious Life hat and answer this from the perspective of the work I do on campus here. In my work as Dean of Religious Life, I see a unique aspect of the university. I see a lot of inspiring, powerful examples of service and empathy and religious reconciliation, but I also see the dark side. I see students in my office every week who are struggling with real trauma. And much of the trauma I see emerges from existential angst that comes out of a struggle to answer the ultimate questions in their life. Who am I? What does my life mean? What is the nature of God? How do I translate my values into action? Basically the questions of meaning and purpose, of significance, and of authenticity. What we've done that makes us very different than other offices of religious life or university chaplains' offices is to not orient our work around God, but around these ultimate questions of meaning and purpose and significance and authenticity. So I want to be a resource for everyone at USC, not just those who self-identify as religious. For those who do self-identify as religious, we have as many chaplains and opportunities to participate in religious life as any university. But for those who don't, we still want them to think deeply about these big questions of meaning and purpose in their life, because I see how disconnection of big questions leads to a particular of angst and trauma that makes a university experience very difficult for our students. And when they graduate, they often don't know where they're standing. So why are these questions of what is sacred important? I think they're really important for people who do not consider themselves religious. And I challenge my non-religious students to identify what is sacred for them. Maybe a football game. When I got here, people like the real religion on campus is football. I thought it was a joke, but not really. I mean, you go to the Coliseum, you go on a pilgrimage, you wear hats, you have rituals. It's agony, ecstasy. It's mythology. It's sort of a tradition. It's part of a community. It's many of the things that our religious communities provide for us. So I want to challenge my students to think about what is sacred to them, even if it's so-called a secular song or game or tradition, because if they can find what is sacred to them, even if they're not religious, even if they're not believing God, I do believe that then helps them orient their own lives around the questions of meaning and purpose and significance and authenticity. And I'll emphasize questions, because I want my students to live those questions, not necessarily to find those answers. Now, that's at odds with what's happening at the rest of the university. In every class, they're looking for their answers. But I think in spiritual life, the questions are often more important. The answers may change, but the questions don't change. And if I can do anything, it's to challenge my students to think deeply about the big questions in their life, to cultivate a sense of sacred as they define it in their lives, and to connect the dots between what they think personally and how they move professionally through the world.
I'm going to start my timer so I keep myself honest. I think that stories give us meaning. And as somebody who, I told you about my media background, I've always believed in the power of stories and the power of stories to help connect us to people that we have nothing in common with, or that we think that we have nothing in common with, that we ultimately can find a thread of something that connects us to another human being, and that our sacred stories, no matter where they come from, whether they're Native American traditions or Eastern traditions or Western traditions or Judeo-Christian traditions or Dharmic traditions, they give us a well of stories to draw lessons from and to derive meaning from and to derive inspiration from. And I think that in today's climate, where things are, as cliche as it sounds, things are moving faster than ever, and it's hard to feel like our feet are still attached to the earth, when our heads are in our phones and we're trying to deal with, this election, and we're trying to think about the future of our country, and we're trying to get home on time, all at the same time, that the sacred is the place that can give us stillness and that can help us find a moment of quiet in that day to reconnect to ourselves and to reconnect to something bigger than us. And that the sacred can come back into daily life. This is as cheesy as this sounds, one of my sacred memories growing up was coming home after school, and my mom would watch Oprah every day, right? And in the later years, Oprah would have this segment at the end of her show that was Discovering Your Spirit or Finding Your Spirit. I can't quite remember the name of it, but it had to do with this idea of tapping into your spirit. And that, to me, gave us a daily practice of thinking about, because I would get home just in time, for that, and it gave us something to talk about and a moment of quiet and stillness that was rooted in somebody else's story and helped us connect back to our own stories and where we were trying to go. And it was that moment of remembrance. And so the sacred spaces, the sacred clothing, it's all minutia to me, frankly, as a person who is trying to live my faith, because these places and these tools, clothing, locations, they're not about people. And ultimately, my belief in God is rooted in my belief in other people and in the values of courage, compassion, mercy, and justice that are all rooted in the relational. So I hope that the power of stories today can be more relevant than ever in providing something sacred and helping people to think about what is sacred in their own lives. Because as I say in my own community all the time, 2 minutes and 30 seconds, I'll stop. As I say in my own community all the time, it's great that we're building more and more mosques. It's great that there's over 2,000 mosques in this country. But if there's nobody to inherit those mosques, if there's nobody to, if there's no children running around in those mosques, if leadership isn't being transferred to the next generation, then we just have real estate that we own and that no one is going to inherit. And that will be the greatest tragedy of all, because our sacred spaces, our sacred clothing, all of this is a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself.
I think sort of building off of that, in my mind, the greatest danger to the sacred is when it becomes divorced from the ethical. C.S. Lewis wrote, next to the sacrament itself, your neighbor, the holiest object presented, which presents itself to your view. And I understand the theory behind this for C.S. Lewis, his belief in divine presence and real presence of Jesus in the host. But in my own theology, I would disagree with him somewhat, and I would say that there's nothing that presents to you that is holier than your neighbor. Not a temple, not the host, not a symbol, not a vestment of sacred clothing, not a sacred nation, literally thing in this world that is holier than your neighbor. Now, this comes out of my own theology of a sense that we're all children of God and invested with true divinity, but it also comes from a deep commitment to human rights and human dignity, which I think operates kind of functionally as the closest thing we have to a kind of secular civil religion, a moral code for a secular pluralist world. And so I think if we want to, I think one of the greatest challenges to people who are religious, people who claim religion, is when they divorce their lives from a sense of the ethical, a sense of care and concern for the other, care and concern for the earth, and care and concern for the weak and the vulnerable. When we do that, then the sacred loses its power, and then we have a problem with the next generation. So I think the greatest challenge, but also opportunity before us with the sacred, is to always imbue it with a powerful sense of the ethical.
Thank you. I agree with the panelists, but I also say that the question touches my spirit as to how can we grow on this? What are the next steps? What do we do for the future? I'm reminded of the prayer that Jesus prayed in John chapter 17. Lord, make us one. Make them one as we are one. And therefore, it is, if we want to understand one, if we're going to grow, going to one, there has to be a dialogue between the understood and the not, the teachable and the non-teachable, those that know and those that don't know. So therefore, this setting cannot sit here. It is something that is very imperative, especially in my community, so that we can understand that everyone have a sacred place. And not only does everyone have a sacred place, but we must respect that everyone have a sacred place. And not only that, but we must begin to interact with everyone so that we can be able to understand. This issue is not just an issue here in Los Angeles. It is global as it relates to where are we going to go from here. The question is still asking, is still being asked. What can we do? How can we bring it together? My sacred place, more valuable than yours. None of our sacred places has no more authority, no more power, as long as we're reaching the God that we believe in. And there is a God, and not only is there a God, but God wants us to look at every mankind with much dignity and respect for whatever they are and whoever they are. I really believe that the burning of churches and the mosques and all of that, it is those individuals who really lack a sacred space. So therefore, if we're going to better our world, our community, locally and globally, there must be a dialogue, must continue, where we can be able to understand one another and put it in the community that we are going to be an answer to Jesus' prayer.
This is really a question Jack talked about the existential question and who am I and all these big questions. This is a sense of where do we belong? And a lot of the trouble, certainly in England, is that we are a society adrift. We are just free from everything, like free from any sense of direction, and all sorts of things have gone wrong. Freedom has gone wild. And one of the things that I do to illustrate this, and this is why I was busily scribbling on this piece of paper, if you can do this yourself at home, get a piece of paper and put a random 12 crosses on it in any shape. And then show it to someone and say, how many crosses there? And take it away straight away and say, I didn't have time to count. If you put them up as 3 rows of 4, you could flash those same 12 crosses for 1 second, and people know that that is a familiar pattern, and they can say straight away, 12. And I think if we can live with familiar patterns, with established symbols, shared stories, all these things we've been hearing about, instead of allowing our clever media to chip away at the very foundations of our society, if we can learn these things that have kept us together for such a long time, then I think a lot more people will be a lot happier. But certainly in England, I blame our media for a lot of our problems. They have been too clever. They have been chopping away at the branch that supported them. They have been undermining the foundations of the world that they lived in. And they thought it was clever. And now, of course, they've succeeded, and the branches have fallen off the tree, and the buildings are falling down. So I think we've got to recover and restate, and if you like, reassert the stories, the shapes, the patterns in our societies, in our different cultures side by side, so that we actually know where we belong, that we can't actually do exactly as we like all the time. We've got to think about other people. We've got to respect boundaries and things like that. So there's a lot of challenges there. This is Granny talking, but I do think we have cut away things, really, because we were all overgrown adolescents and we never really grew up.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Heartfelt thanks to everyone. Our conference owes a deep debt of gratitude to so many people who have worked hard to make it happen. Please join me in a round of applause for the John A. Widtsoe Foundation, sponsors, and all the staff that have made this possible. And thank you. I hope as a result of this we will all see our lives individually and collectively coming together as more organized, more beautifully arranged, intertwined, more interrelated, that we will be able to add more with all of our heart, might, mind, and strength, and neighbors ourselves. And I hope that these threads of holiness have been unveiled to us brightly and warmly, running through our separate and collective religious traditions. Larry, thank you very much for the vision to bring this together. And please join me in thanking Larry Eastman.
And I, too, would like to give a thank you, first off, to our staff, to Jan, to Ellen, to Jacob, who really made this happen, to Mike and the others who have recorded this and taken it to the world. Can you all stand up and wave so that people know who did the work and made it happen? You know, we have been enlightened, and I'm so appreciative for all of you for being here. We've had a global audience. As you know, we've had now almost 1,000 people representing more than 10 countries who have watched this, so we think this is a historic opportunity. Special thanks to USC, special thanks to Dean Varansani and to Lori Meeks and to the department. I must tell you, however, in your earlier comment, at USC, we follow Vince Lombardi's teaching, and that is that football is not a matter of life and death. It's more important than that. Thanks, a big thanks to the Catholic Caruso, which has made this really just beautiful ability available to us. It is a sacred space for all of us, and I'm so delighted we could be here and hear the possibilities of what we can become, the possibilities of what we can do, the hope that we can bring a global community together, not just to study sacred spaces, but to become part of those sacred spaces. I'm reminded of Robert Drumlow's comment in his 1920 commentary on the Bible. He said, "The Bible does not offer arguments to prove the existence of deity, but it offers something which is far more valuable to most of us than an abstract proof. It gives us a concrete, experimental, descriptive theology. It shows us a picture of the world with God at work in it, which is the devout, appreciative soul instinctively recognizes as truth. It offers us, largely in the concrete form of narrative and history, a theory of the universe which, rightly understood, is found to meet the demands of hearts and minds alike, revealing a God whose character is such and whose relation to man is such that in him both our needs and our aspirations find satisfaction. At the same time, it incidentally provides a theory of human nature that affords us the only satisfactory key to the reason for those needs and aspirations. It gives us the explanation of man's actual littleness and his potential greatness." And I think that describes for me what we have been about. And so I would close this by simply repeating what you all have heard so many times throughout your life. "Speak unto Aaron and unto his sons, saying, On this wise ye shall bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace." Thank you.